Well, hi everybody, Dr. David Perlmutter here, and we're going to be learning today about salt. You know, for so many years we were told don't use salt, something terrible will happen. And now we're learning that there is really another side to the story, that perhaps some of the hype about salt being so detrimental to health might be a bit overblown, and that we might want to embrace this important mineral. The book that we're going to talk about is called The Salt Fix by James DiNicolantonio. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He is a cardiovascular research scientist and doctor of pharmacy at St. Luke's Mid-America Heart Institute in Kansas City, Missouri. He's well respected and internationally known as a scientist and as an expert on health and nutrition. He has contributed extensively to health policy as well as to the medical literature. He serves as the associate editor of British Medical Journal's Open Heart, a journal that's published in partnership with the British Cardiovascular Society. He's also on the editorial advisory board of several other medical and scientific journals, including Progress in Cardiovascular Diseases and International Journal of Clinical Pharmacology and Toxicology. So I'm really looking forward to our interview. We're going to learn all about salt today, so here we go. Well, welcome, Dr. DiNicolantonio.
Thanks for having me.
And in the intro for our viewers, we're talking about your new book, The Salt Fix, and I think your contention, correct me if I'm wrong, is that by and large we may have gotten it wrong in terms of the widespread notion that salt is the devil's plaything.
Exactly. I mean, so basically kind of what happened with salt was the same story that happened with saturated fat. We blamed saturated fat for being bad based off of a single surrogate marker, LDL, cholesterol, and we blame salt being bad for a single surrogate marker, blood pressure. And really we extrapolated the blood pressure raising effects in only salt-sensitive people, which is only about 20% of the population, and the other 80% aren't sensitive to salt. And so we kind of demonize salt for a minority of people who might be sensitive to it.
You know, that said, and I am with you on that, but the pushback is the Haynes study that did find a fairly linear correlation in not just, in hypertensive more than non-hypertensive patients in terms of salt consumption. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, so there were 3 Haynes studies actually, and every single one of those actually showed that those people who ate the lowest salt actually had the highest risk of cardiovascular events and early all-cause mortality. And actually that was confirmed by the PURE study, which actually looked at over 100,000 people as well.
So why then do cardiologists and generally physicians continue to tell people to dramatically limit their sodium here in the United States, where at least 97 to 99% of individuals are consuming higher levels than recommended?
Yes. So really it stems from the 1977 dietary goals. We were basically given the low salt advice before we ever had any evidence. I mean, the Cochrane collaboration wasn't even created until 1993. And so we demonized the substance before we really had any data on it. And so it was the same thing with saturated fat. Everybody still believes saturated fat is bad because it raises LDL cholesterol. When you actually look at the studies, there's no study proving that saturated fat actually increases mortality. And the same thing with salt. There's no proof that eating a normal salt diet is actually going to increase your risk of death. There's not a single study that actually proves that.
So I guess the issue then is how do we define a normal salt diet?
Right. And I mean, in the book too, I kind of go over, there's a lot of things that actually cause you to become depleted in salt that we don't even realize. So take, for example, caffeine or coffee. I mean, just 4 cups of coffee,
I would love
you
to.
lose.
A little late in the afternoon for me, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, me being Italian, actually, I could drink all night, but you lose a half a teaspoon of salt in the urine when you consume just 4 cups of coffee. And so that's something that we didn't have back in evolutionary times. And if you don't replace that, you're going to be potentially slowly depleted in salt. And any caffeinated beverage will do that.
And alcohol.
alcohol as well. And take exercise, for example, where the American Heart Association tells everyone we should be exercising about 60 minutes a day. The average person is going to lose about a half a teaspoon of salt per hour of exercise. And yet they tell everybody to eat less than about 1 teaspoon of salt or even less. And so you have to kind of understand the things that can deplete salt in either diet or lifestyle. And if you are following this blanket statement, it doesn't apply to people like athletes or people who drink coffee and things like that.
Well, then you talk about historically, where did our ancestors get salt in our Paleolithic times?
Sure. So if you look at, let's say, the last 10,000 years, Romans used to consume 25 grams of salt. So about 2.5 times what we eat today. Everything was packed in salt because we didn't have refrigerators. So for the last 10,000 years, actually, the average intake of salt was at least 2 to 3 times higher than it is today. I mean, if you look at the longest living cultures, Japan, South Korea, they actually eat the highest amounts of salt. So it doesn't even make sense on a population level why we would think low salt would be good for us. But if you look at even an evolutionary perspective, where would we get salt? That's a great question. We used to consume the whole animal. So we would get salt through the blood, through the interstitial fluid, the organs. Blood contains 3,200 milligrams per liter of sodium. We used to actually harvest algae too. So spirulina, which is a blue-green algae, actually is very high in salt. It contains 400 milligrams of sodium per ounce. And we would follow animals to salt licks. We weren't stupid. We could literally obtain salt either through salt licks or we would get it through brackish water if we needed it.
There's a big push these days for people to go on a ketogenic diet, and I'm certainly have been advocating that for many reasons as well. Do you find that is one of the reasons people actually are lower in sodium?
Yes, that's a great question. The keto flu, which when you cut your carb intake, insulin levels go down. And insulin isn't just a fat-storing hormone. It is a hormone that helps the kidneys retain salt. So when you lower your insulin levels on a ketogenic diet, you actually not only excrete more salt, but glucose helps you absorb salt. So when you're not eating exogenous glucose, you're not even absorbing sodium as well. And the other thing is ketone bodies themselves are actually negatively charged. So the more ketone bodies you produce and eliminate, you actually have to pull a positively charged cation like sodium with it.
So what other minerals, while you're on a ketogenic diet, would you think are important to keep an eye on?
Well, magnesium is very important too. And what's interesting is actually sodium controls your magnesium status. And so there's been actually numerous studies showing that if you put people on a low sodium diet, the body will start pulling sodium from the bone to maintain normal levels, but it also pulls magnesium and calcium at the same time. And so numerous studies have actually shown low salt diets lead to negative magnesium and calcium balance. And those get flushed out too when you lower your insulin levels as well on a ketogenic diet. So those are kind of minerals too that are hard to get if you're just eating a lot of high fat foods and you're not getting some type of high magnesium foods like spinach and other nuts and seeds and things like that.
Well, here in America, probably 70 to 80% of adults are probably not where they need to be, at least as it relates to magnesium, and perhaps secondarily with respect to food-sourced potassium. You bring up an interesting topic, and that is the role of sodium in insulin functionality. And you did make a point in the book that insulin resistance and therefore elevated blood sugar might not simply, but that low salt can contribute to that. Can you walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah. So basically sodium, if you reduce it, again, the kidneys are going to try to hold on to that salt. And how they do that is they actually create the body a state called insulin resistance, and that elevates insulin levels. So the kidneys can hold on to more salt. And so salt does. The studies show that lowering your salt intake will actually worsen glucose tolerance as bad as chronically increasing your sugar intake. That's how bad low salt is for AUC glucose tolerance test. It literally will raise it by about 40% when you cut your salt intake. And not only that is blood flow to the liver, where your liver breaks down insulin. And so salt is one of your best ways to increase circulation and blood flow to the liver. So because your liver isn't able to break down the insulin also increases. And then the blood flow to your muscles goes down as well. So your muscles can't soak up the glucose as well, which elevates your insulin levels. So there's a lot of things that are happening why you become insulin resistant on a low salt diet.
I'm just thinking that your typical 50, 60-year-old patient comes in and has some mild elevation of cholesterol, and maybe a mild elevation of blood pressure. What are the first things the doctor does? You put that patient on a statin medication. What does that do? Well, in males, it increases their risk for diabetes by 40%, and in females, it may be as high as 72%, according to well-published research. And the other thing you do is you restrict their sodium. So you are really setting the stage by these two maneuvers, using a statin medication and sodium restriction, according to peer-reviewed literature, of creating a diabetic out of an individual who might not have been.
Right.
You have talked about also generally the role of sodium in terms of issues with heart rate. How does that work?
Yeah. So basically, because if you're not getting adequate, salt, its main function actually is to give us a blood pressure. Everybody fears blood pressure. Everyone feels cholesterol, but these things are necessary. And so when you don't have good blood volume, what ends up happening is your heart rate has to work harder to pump all the blood around the body. And so most people will actually have about a 5 beat per minute increase so for every minute, their heart is beating 5 times more on a low salt diet than on a normal salt diet. And when you look at blood pressure and heart rate and multiply the two, in almost every case, it's dramatically worsened on a low salt diet versus even a normal salt diet. And blood pressure multiplied by heart rate is what determines the stress on your arteries and your heart.
So is this an ejection fraction issue then because of compromised volume?
It's partly that there's a reduction in blood volume, and it's also a reduction in circulation. Literally, the circulation and the dilation of your arteries goes down on a low salt diet. And that's partly why you actually become insulin resistant as well, is because when you cut your salt intake, the blood vessels constrict. Mm-hmm. And so you end up increasing and you end up reducing glucose getting into the muscle because there's a constriction of those blood vessels.
You mentioned other issues in your book that may be related to restricting your sodium intake, like mental clarity, for example, being compromised. What is that mechanism?
Yeah, that's you'll really appreciate that. So when I was researching for the book, I didn't realize that sodium actually helps us absorb in the intestine vitamin C. And then I actually started doing research on what does sodium control other ions in the body. And it actually helps bring in vitamin C into the brain. It takes 2 sodium ions to bring in 1 ascorbic acid. And not only that, literally sodium drives vitamin C into the skin and into the bone. And so vitamin C is one of the best antioxidants in the brain. And then what you end up happening is there's a lot of cognitive decline too with low salt, because you literally have a reduction in blood flow to the brain. And so not only are you driving lots of vitamin C into the brain on a low salt diet, but you have a reduction in blood flow. And so that can lead to a compromised cognitive function, and clinical studies have shown that.
And what about sleep?
Yeah, so yes, low salt diets have been clinically proven in studies. It was the TAIM study, TAIM, to actually significantly reduce and worsen sleep. So it leads to insomnia. I don't know the exact mechanism. They didn't even try to explain why, but it did significantly increase insomnia. And it may have to do with, a lack of vitamin C in the brain.
Mm-hmm. Immune function has been correlated with salt restriction as well, or compromise of immune function.
Yeah, actually, our immune cells use chloride to kill invading bacteria. And so salt is made up of not just sodium, but also chloride. And so we get this, hydrochlorous acid that is produced using chloride from salt. And same with our stomach acid. Literally low salt diets reduce your body's ability to digest food because it reduces your stomach acid. And that can lead to things like acid reflux. And, everything starts at the gut. If you can't break down your food because you don't have enough stomach acid because you're not eating enough salt, that can lead to all types of mineral issues. So it really goes to show you how salt can control a lot of the minerals in your body. So
is there such a thing as too much salt in the diet?
That's a great question. So when I was researching
I'm 3 for 3.
You're 3 for 3. The kidneys actually filter a full teaspoon of salt every 5 minutes. So they're filtering over 3 pounds of salt every day. And so if you eat a teaspoon of salt, they filter that in 5 minutes. And so if you're not salt sensitive, studies have shown they've given people up to 100 grams, which is 10 times the normal salt intake. There is not a single rise in blood pressure. It depends on if you have healthy kidney function or if you don't. So if you have normal kidney function, it's very difficult to get too much salt. But if you do, if you are salt sensitive, you should test yourself. You shouldn't just, eat loads of salt and just think you're going to be okay, right?
Okay, so if you're talking about people who are salt sensitive, how would a person know?
So one of the tests would be to either go on a low salt diet for a couple days, or you would go from a low salt to a normal salt diet. And if there is a dramatic change in your blood pressure, something that's clinically significant, maybe around 5 or 10 points on the top number, you're classified as salt sensitive. But even if let's say your blood pressure goes up by 5 or 10 points, but your heart rate goes down by 10 points, it's hard to really say, are you really at an elevated risk or at a lower risk?
Right, so because those things tend to offset each other. So how many people, what percentage of people are salt sensitive?
So if you look at the population, only about 20% of people are salt sensitive. Now, if you have high blood pressure, about 1 in 2 people are salt sensitive. But in the book, I kind of discussed the underlying factors of what may be causing people to be salt sensitive. One of them being insulin resistance. So if you are consuming a lot of refined carbohydrates and grains and sugar, that's leading to high insulin levels and causing you to over-retain salt. So if you drop the sugar, you can fix your salt sensitivity in a lot of cases. There's also people. Go ahead.
No, I'm just going to say. I remember you were you were saying that that our problem is not. It's that we are consuming too much of a white crystalline powder, but it's not salted sugar. So I guess we've got our powders mixed up.
We do. And in fact, what's interesting is if there's been animal studies that show that the way the body works if you don't have enough sodium is to actually hyperactivate the brain's reward system. That's what caused us in Paleolithic times to actually go out and search for salt. And we would get a greater high from it when we would consume it. So if you're not getting enough salt, what ends up happening is your reward center in the brain is hyperactivated, and things like sugar and drugs of abuse can actually hijack that. And so low salt diets in animals actually increase the response to things like cocaine, Adderall, and sugar because they're hijacking your brain's activated reward system on a low salt diet. So you can almost fix sugar cravings by increasing your salt intake.
Interesting. So there's an interesting book called The Hijacking of the American Mind. I have it right here, actually, by Robert Lustig, that really goes, for any of the viewers who want to read that, really talks about those pathways, the reward pathways, the ventral tegmental area, etc., and how we are just really catering to those addiction centers through our modern behavior, be it fat, salt, sugar, and we really get to a point that we almost can't stop. But again, I want to get back to this notion that lowering your salt intake because your doctor told you to might make it harder to avoid eating sugar because you have to satisfy that dopamine surge somehow. I mean, is that a thing?
Right. That is a thing. I mean, studies in animals show it. And what's interesting too is, how do you get people to eat healthy food, right? The goal is to get them to eat healthy, but how do you get them to do that? Like my kids, they won't eat vegetables or nuts unless you put salt on them. So if you use salt as a gateway to eating healthy, you can lower the sugar intake. So there's another way because not only is salt reducing the bitterness, but in a way it provides sweetness. So you can almost use less sugar in your food by adding salt.
Yes, oddly enough, even lemon juice can make things taste sweet. So we have the mouthfeel that we need for satisfaction. I mean, manufacturers of food products are just totally dialed into this notion of mouthfeel. That includes things like sweet or unctuous or savory or fatty types of sensations, and probably salt as well. So you're saying then that if we can develop a sense of appreciation for salt, that it might tend to pull us away from the need for sweet satisfaction.
Exactly. And I mean, even if you overconsume salt, right, we actually have what's called a salt thermostat. It's very similar to our thirst for water. And the reason why we have a salt thermostat where if you get too much, your body will tell you and you will reduce your consumption automatically throughout the day, unless you're eating processed foods and you're getting it and you're not even realizing it. we have this salt center in the brain because it's an essential mineral, whereas sugar, we don't need it. And so because it's an essential mineral, our body actually has a control center for its intake.
In the hypothalamus. I'm going to tell you, I know what it's like to write a book that challenges the mainstream. Obviously, I mean, when I wrote Grain Brain 5 years ago, I was saying things like, hey, maybe we should cut back on our sugar, our processed carbohydrates, and gluten might be issues with respect to general health and certainly brain health. And that, I know what it's like to raise eyebrows and to confront mainstream sort of ideology. You've done that now. How's it working out for you?
Well, good. I mean, I think a lot of people started realizing and understanding the benefits of salt when they actually started adding it back to their diet. I mean, I was getting hundreds of emails saying, I've never felt better.
Yeah.
And part of the reason is we don't even realize how many things can lead to salt deficiency. And so when people started upping their salt intake and feeling better, if you look at the literature, I mean, low sodium levels in the blood is the most common electrolyte abnormality in the United States. Over 6 million people have it. And that's just one way of measuring salt deficiency. The other way is if you get up from like a seated to a standing position and you feel dizzy, a lot of times you're salt deficient. And I mean, that's one of the most common, symptoms that people complain about. And so we kind of need to get a little bit better at diagnosing salt deficiency. That's why I think a lot of people don't really understand that they're potentially salt deficient. It's because you can't always just look at blood levels of sodium, just like with magnesium, to test if you are truly deficient.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I think that the more functional evaluations, getting up from a seated position, feeling lightheaded, are quite indicative of volume, of the need to expand volume. One of the reasons I think that bone broth has really taken off, aside from the fact that it has collagens, good source of protein, etc., has some good fat in it, is I think it's giving people back that sodium that you talk about, that they desperately need. So many people are using bone broth and finding out that they feel better and that their athletic performance, etc., seem to be improving. And it might well have to do with the fact that they're getting more sodium finally back into their diets.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a great point. I mean, one of the best things you can do for your blood pressure is to exercise, and salt has been shown to dramatically improve exercise performance. I mean, the studies show that if you dose yourself with a teaspoon of salt and 21 ounces of water a half hour prior to exercising in the heat, you increase your blood volume by about 10%. And when you exercise, that blood volume goes to your muscle. And so if by raising acutely your blood volume, dosing yourself with salt before exercise, it's been shown you can exercise 21 minutes longer, and it keeps you a full degree cooler because you have more fluid circulating the body.
I'm smiling because I know exactly what that's like. I mean, I know what it's like to run in hot weather and how I feel sometimes after a hard run. And I'm grateful that I use salt. I'm again, I think people have to make up their own minds on these issues, but I use truffle salt 3 times a day on my food because I just know I feel better, and my systolic runs around 96. So, but that said, I think your points are very well taken. Sexual performance. You made some comments in your book about sexual performance being improved by using salt.
Yeah, I mean, just like salt controls blood flow, I mean, if you have a reduction to your blood flow to a sexual organ, it can lead to dysfunction. And so the studies do show that low salt diets do lead to erectile dysfunction in men because of the reduction in blood circulation. But there's one thing I wanted to touch on when you had mentioned that you use salt, when you're running in the heat. We actually lose a tremendous amount of iodine through sweat as well. And so if you can get a salt that contains good amounts of iodine, the table salt and even the iodized table salt, they don't use real iodine. They use potassium iodide, but we lose up to 100 micrograms of iodine per hour of exercise. And we're supposed to get 150 micrograms per day. And so just 1 hour of exercise can flush out almost your entire day's worth of iodine. So if you can eat something like real salt, Redmond real salt is just one that I like, it brings real iodine with it. And that's another important mineral that people are missing by going on a low salt diet.
And hence the prevalence of hypothyroidism. Well, listen, thank you so much for joining us. I really enjoyed your book. I mean, as you know, I had the opportunity to look at your book early on before it was published, and um, it was really necessary. I mean, we've labored through this whole ideology for such a long time, and people, I think, have been led astray. You bring attention to the misinformation related to saturated fat and draw a similarity with respect to salt. And I think it's well taken because, at the end of the day, we need to look back at what the medical literature is telling us. And I think you did a great job researching those references and making them very clear that, salt has been a part of the human experience for a long, long time. And now suddenly, in the past couple of decades, we've been told everybody should abandon the salt shaker. And I think you make some very good points that we need sodium. So it's great. I appreciate that.
Thanks so much.
Okay. We will talk soon.
All right.
Well, that was an eye-opening interview, wasn't it? The other side to salt that we may not have known about. We've all grown up in a time when salt was really castigated, and now we're hearing that, in fact, salt has some issues associated with it that might actually be important for our health. Dr. DiNicolantonio's book is The Salt Fix, a very intriguing book. It's worth a read. It's, again, going to give you some information that you might not have been aware of. Hope you enjoyed the interview today. Thanks for joining us. I'm Dr. David Perlmutter. Bye for now.